Today we voted on a bill referred to as net neutrality. It's a position that was taken up by the Federal Communications Commission back during the Obama administration. It was quite interesting during the Obama administration. President Obama had said he would not allow the FCC to take control over the internet, and then apparently was convinced otherwise and eventually made clear to the FCC they would take over control of the internet. And so I know the bill is referred to as net neutrality, but it's anything but neutral. It's government control of the internet. And yes, I realize that the internet has produced some billionaires who are tremendous contributors to the Democratic Party. But to me, it's more the issue, and to my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, it's more an issue of independence of this incredible invention, the internet. If it creates more billionaires that happen to become Democrats, so be it. But let's leave the internet free. Net neutrality does not leave it free. It is government control. And that is what the new chairman, Chairman Pai, undid. He said, we're backing off. This was an executive position taken by the executive branch during the Obama administration, and we are now, as an executive branch, taking our hands off of the internet so that people are free to become billionaires, but we are not going to pick and choose winners. There was, which means the government chooses losers as well. A good article from James Gattuso from March 11th, 2019. He says just over 1 year ago, the Federal Communications Commission voted 3-2 to repeal the network neutrality rules it adopted. And that's such a misnomer, net neutrality, that had been adopted in 2015. However, the FCC regulation could make a comeback if House Democrats have their way. Lawmakers in the House and Senate introduced legislation Thursday to restore the rule. That's from last week. Sponsored by Senator Ed Markey, Democrat from Massachusetts, and Representative Mike Dole, Democrat from Pennsylvania, the three-page bill makes no attempt to modify or improve the 2015 rule. It simply declares that the 2017 order repealing net neutrality, quote, shall have no force or effect, unquote. Formerly titled the, quote, Open Internet Order, unquote, the FCC imposed the rule 4 years ago under its Democratic chairman, Tom Wheeler. But the political battle over net neutrality has gone on close to 17 years. A Columbia University law professor, Tim Wu, coined the term net neutrality in 2002. Wu argued that because internet service providers such as Comcast and AT&T enjoy near bottleneck control over the traffic going to web users, they should be prohibited from favoring any web content over another. In other words, according to Wu, internet service providers should be required to treat content providers neutrally. But regulation makes problems of its own. Today's market for internet access is not perfectly competitive, but is also clearly not a monopoly. Most Americans have the ability to choose from at least 2 service providers. And this is critical here. It says, in addition, so-called net neutrality would do nothing to increase the number of companies that compete in the market for access. In fact, it would make it harder for new entrants to compete effectively with existing market leaders. That's because one of the best ways to get a foothold in a market is to differentiate its service. It's called competition. This goes on and says, for instance, T-Mobile, to differentiate itself in its struggle to compete with industry leaders AT&T and Verizon, pioneered zero-rating pricing plans that allow free access to content from participating content providers without incurring a charge against your data cap. T-Mobile's free data option has made wireless broadband available to millions at affordable rates. Zero rating, nevertheless, has been condemned by many as a violation of net neutrality and could be banned should Congress restore the rule. Now, that's what's so amazing about this term net neutrality. It means the government could and probably would say to somebody like T-Mobile, and I don't have their service, I don't have a dog in that fight, but they can say to an entity like T-Mobile, look, we're not going to let you have a no-charge access to data through your plan, through your wireless plan. No, that won't work. You got to charge something. If this net neutrality, so-called, which when you hear net neutrality, it ought to mean, in your mind, government control, because it's actually antithetical to what it says it is. It's government control. But that would say to somebody that's trying to break into the market, that's saying, okay, we'll give you free access, no cost, for no data cap, so that we can get into the market, develop customers, they'll be loyal to us. No, the government, once net neutrality / government control were to be back in place, they can say you can't do that. We're not going to let you become competitive with the two companies that control the lion's share of the internet. Government shouldn't be in that business. Let it be competitive. It just seems every time the government gets its hands on something that's been as productive as the internet, it chokes it. It overwhelms it with regulation. It's been one of the beauties of the internet. So, as this article says, net neutrality, government control, is not needed to save the internet, but in fact could jeopardize it. The FCC was right to reject the net neutrality or government control rules completely, and Congress should do the same, even though it has passed the House. We did pick up 13 Democrats voted with the Republicans who said, look, let's at least add a provision to this bill that forbids the government from taxing. Just completely forbids it. Says you can't tax the internet. For internet service, you're not going to tax internet service. And so that was bipartisan. We had 13 Democrats vote with us. We don't want to tax the internet service. But unfortunately, was narrowly defeated by a majority, being all Democrats voted, to allow the potential to tax the internet. So that ought to tell you basically what you need to know about net neutrality. It's going to be a way, number one, for government control, and number two, to eventually get around to providing revenue. That means taxes on what has not been taxed so far. Greg Walden, who was managing this bill, had a good article. He said net neutrality is a bipartisan issue in Congress. Despite the overheated rhetoric and the political talking points, Democrats actually agree with me and my Republican colleagues on the key net neutrality parameters that protect a free and open internet for consumers. Democrats agree with Republicans that internet traffic should not be blocked. There's bipartisan support for prohibiting the blocking of legal content on the internet. Democrats agree with Republicans that internet service providers should not be allowed to impair or degrade lawful internet traffic on the basis of content, as long as it's legal, a practice known as throttling. There is bipartisan support for prohibiting the throttling of legal content on the internet. But he goes on to say, Democrats, however, believe that net neutrality can only be achieved by regulating the internet as if it were a utility under Title II of the Communications Act, which was originally used to govern monopoly telephone companies in the 1930s. The, quote, Save the Net Act, unquote, imposes the heavy hand of Washington's regulatory bureaucracy over the single most important driver of economic growth, job creation, and better quality of life for all Americans. This will do everything but save the internet. Title II sounds inconsequential, but layering this new national governance over the web, over the internet, would give the Federal Communications Commission unbridled regulatory authority over the internet. The government would have the power to tax the internet, because most of the Democrats voted to allow taxing the internet, and it would allow them to dictate where and when new broadband networks can be deployed and take over the management of private networks. In a rural district like his in Eastern Oregon, Title II inhibited the ability of small internet service providers to expand broadband to underserved communities, saddling these small businesses with onerous reporting requirements that shifted their focus from their customers to new, expensive regulatory interference. Nationwide, Title II had a chilling effect on the internet investment, which declined for the first time since the dawn of the internet age, decreasing consumer choice and increasing the digital divide. As Greg Walden says, fortunately, we do not need Title II to achieve real net neutrality. Republicans have put forth serious proposals, menu of options that would keep the internet open and free so it can continue to be a driver of opportunity for all. But that means, since it just passed the House, we're going to need to count on the Senate not to take up more government control of the internet, but instead to take up a bill that does keep things fair instead of having more government control and potentially taxing internet usage. Shift to another topic, since Attorney General Barr testified this week, maybe testifying again. It's interesting, as more information comes rolling out about the Muellergate. This article from the Daily Caller from Chuck Ross. Cambridge academic reflects on interactions with Spygate figure. Her name is Svetlana Lokova. Says she did not get along with Stephen Halper, which is what she says made a dinner invitation to Cambridge University professor's home in January 2016 all the more peculiar. Quote, Halper was a lurking presence with a horrible aura. I avoided him, said Lokova, a Cambridge postgraduate student who studies Soviet-era espionage. Lokova dodged the invitation to Halper's home, which she said was sent to her by Christopher Andrew, a Cambridge professor and official historian for MI5 the British Domestic Intelligence Service. But the past 3 years have revealed new details about Halper and other activities that went on at Cambridge that have caused Lakova to question why she was asked to dinner at Halper's. For one, a series of stories that appeared in the press in early 2017 heavily implied Lakova was a Russian agent who tried to suborn Michael Flynn at a dinner hosted at Cambridge, February 28, 2014. Flynn served at the time as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. A year after those stories appeared, the Daily Caller News Foundation reported Halper cozied up to 3 Trump campaign advisors: Carter Page, Sam Clovich, George Papadopoulos. Isn't that interesting? Those are the ones, particularly Carter Page and George Papadopoulos, those are the people that the Department of Justice and FBI used to claim they were some kind of ties to Russia, when now we're finding out it was Fusion GPS, was Bruce Orr at the FBI, his wife Nellie Orr working with Fusion GPS and working with foreign agents. Former foreign agent also, we know, from MI6. But apparently they're working with the British government in trying to create reasons that the FBI could go before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court, FISA's secret star chamber, and get warrants to spy on the Trump campaign. It's all starting to come out. This is somebody who is now described, or has been in the last 2 years, oh, this was a Russian agent. Turns out she was being manipulated by MI5 and by people, as we'll be finding out, with the Justice Department, FBI, Clinton campaign, try to set up so that they could go after the Trump campaign officials, spy on them, and potentially bring down the Trump campaign as an insurance policy, just in case the unthinkable happened and Donald Trump were elected president. The article goes on, a year after those stories appeared, as it says, Halper cozied to 3 Trump campaign advisors. In May 2018, Halper was revealed as a longtime CIA and FBI informant, a revelation that led President Donald Trump to accuse the FBI of planting a spy in his campaign. The Republican coined the term Spygate to designate the alleged scandal. After Halper's links to American intelligence were revealed, the New York Times and the Washington Post reported he and another Cambridge luminary, former MI6 chief Richard Dearlove, raised concerns about Lakova's contacts with Flynn that were subsequently passed to American and British intelligence. Far bigger than Watergate, because Watergate concerned people hired by the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, when this involves the spies, own, control, and former spies of the British government working in collusion with the FBI, the Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS. Says Lakova blames Halper for distorting her brief interaction with Flynn into, quote, an international espionage scandal in which she wound up as collateral damage. What Halper staged, she said, is a textbook black op to dirty up the reputation of a political opponent. He needed an innocuous social event to place Flynn in a room with a woman who was ethnically Russian. I was unlucky to be picked. Lakova, a dual Russian and British citizen, has spoken out before about Halper and the allegations about her in the media. She accused Halper of making false and absurd claims about her in a 2018 interview with the DCNF, she has also taken to Twitter to criticize the reporters who published allegations about her and Flynn. The Guardian's Luke Harding is one target of Lakova's ire. She has criticized the British reporter for a March 31st, 2017 story that contained thinly veiled allegations she tried to compromise Flynn. According to the report, which was based on anonymous sources, American and British intelligence developed concerns about Lakova's interactions with Flynn at the February 2014 dinner, which was hosted by the Cambridge Intelligence Seminar. Halper, Dearlove, and Andrew are co-conveners of the seminar, which hosts events for current and former spies. Halper, Dearlove, and Andrew, they appear to be the ones that should have been spied on, but instead they are the ones being used by British intelligence working together with the FBI, the Department of Justice, Fusion GPS, Bruce Orr, Nellie Orr, Clinton campaign to come after Donald Trump. The Wall Street Journal also published an innuendo-laden story March 18, 2017 about Flynn and Lakova. The hook for the story was that Flynn failed to report his contact with Lakova to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Lakova, who has lived in the UK since 1998, vehemently denies the insinuations in the article she is a Russian agent or she tried to seduce Flynn. She has provided emails and photographs to the Daily Caller News Foundation to help back up her case. She also notes that all of the allegations about her have been made anonymously. Dan O'Brien, a Defense Intelligence Agency official who accompanied Flynn to the Cambridge event, told the Wall Street Journal he saw nothing untoward involving Lakova. Lakova's partner, David North, has told the Daily Caller News Foundation he picked Lakova up after the event. Since learning more about Halper, Lakova has reflected back on the few interactions she had with him over the years at Cambridge. A veteran of 3 Republican administrations, Halper joined Cambridge in 2001. From his perch at the Stories University, Halper wrote books about American politics and the geopolitical threat that China poses to the West. He received over $1 million in contracts from the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment to write studies on Russia, China, Afghanistan. It's interesting, as an aside, but Adam Lovinger was working for the Defense Department, and his job was to look for improprieties within the Defense Department. He noticed this $1 million contracts going to Stephen Halper. He said, wait a minute, we're paying this guy $1 million? We're not getting anything for it? What is this about? And for that, the Obama administration crushed Adam Lovinger. He was an honest whistleblower. He wasn't even a whistleblower. He was doing his job, which was to look for improprieties. He found things that raised questions. He raised the questions about why is Stephen Harper being paid all this money? We're not getting anything from this guy that helps the Pentagon. Why is he getting $1 million from the Pentagon? Well, unfortunately for Adam Lovinger, he stepped on a landmine. And the Obama administration set out to get him fired and to destroy him for noticing the impropriety. At least it appeared to be an impropriety. That's why he brought it up, that involved Stephen Halper, that was used by the Obama administration, Justice Department, FBI, Fusion GPS, to help them try to set up the Trump campaign. Lakova says she first remembers seeing Halper in November 2013 when she gave a talk about her research on Soviet-era spy archives. She said, the guy looks at us like we're completely horrible people and then gets up and sits across the room. Lakova said she learned from a Cambridge faculty member that Halper was spreading rumors that she was linked to Russian intelligence. Anyway, it just shows how outrageous the conduct has been that we're now beginning to find out about. And certainly it was high time that after 2 years of finding nothing, for which the Mueller special counsel office was set up, hiring people that hated Trump, they couldn't find anything. They couldn't find evidence that they could take to a grand jury and get an indictment. And that's just probable cause. That's not beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And certainly because Mueller couldn't stand the man that 24 hours before Mueller was offered special counsel job, he had been begging President Trump to make him the director of the FBI again. President Trump turned him down. 24 hours later, he jumps at the chance, although he was certainly should have recused himself. He was conflicted far too many ways to be a special counsel on something involving Russia. He jumped at the chance to investigate the guy that refused to hire him. Another article from Catherine Herridge, and Catherine Herridge has done extraordinary work looking into these different issues. And she points out that a Russian woman claims she was manipulated into entrapping General Flynn, a Russian-born academic who was at the center of attention 2017 for past contact with former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, told Fox News in an exclusive interview she is not a spy for Moscow and, to the contrary, believes she was used to smear Flynn. She said, quote, "I think there's a high chance that it was coordinated. I believe it needs to be properly investigated." So Catherine's done good work on that. And then article from Jason Beal from the Federalist entitled "How Obama Holdover Sally Yates Helped Sink Michael Flynn." And of course, we know Sally Yates was working as the Deputy Attorney General, and she refused to defend constitutional activity by the Trump administration, so she was fired. Unfortunately, there were people that were totally devoted to Sally Yates, couldn't stand Trump, some of whom are still at the Department of Justice undermining the Trump administration. But this goes on to say, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates made a couple of urgent trips from the DOJ building to the White House, carrying information she believed to be critical to U.S. national security. Yates was aware, likely through intercepts of Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, communications that the newly seated National Security Advisor, retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, had discussed with Kislyak Russia's response to Obama administration's imposition of sanctions for Russia's attempt to meddle in the 2016 election. According to news reports, Flynn asked Kislyak to wait a few weeks and allow the incoming Trump administration a chance to review the issue before Russia retaliated. Flynn's conversation with Kislyak occurred December 29th, the day Obama announced the sanctions. Recall that this period between the election of Trump in early November and his inauguration in late January was characterized by a frenzy of questionable and as yet unexplained actions taken by the Obama White House, intelligence agencies, and the State Department. The Steele dossier was in circulation at various levels of government and media officialdom. Carter Page's communications and those of anyone with whom he had communicated and anyone with whom they communicated were being monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Security agency. The great unmasking had also begun, with unprecedented numbers of requests forwarded from various Obama administration officials to the NSA to reveal the identities of American citizens otherwise protected in their reporting and transcribing of intercepts of foreign official communications. Distribution regulations were relaxed to allow wider access to these NSA intercepts. And the word went out through the halls of every government agency to get everything into the system, lest these barbarians coming into office destroy evidence and deny their roles as Russian agents. It was inevitable then that David Ignatius at the Washington Post would publish a column on January 12 describing Flynn's December 29th phone calls with Kislyak, information he attributed to, quote, a senior U.S. government official. Ignatius' column began thusly, quote, sometimes something is rotten in the state of Denmark, mutters Marcellus as ghosts and mad spirits haunt Elsinore Castle in the first act of Shakespeare's Hamlet, unquote. After this past week of salacious leaks about foreign espionage plots and indignant denials, people must be wondering if something is rotten in the state of our democracy. How can we dispel the dark rumors that, as Hamlet says, shake our disposition? Well, the senior U.S. government official who leaked both the name of a U.S. citizen captured in an intercept of foreign government officials' communication and the fact that the foreign official was under NSA surveillance has not been identified, nor has there been any indication that a thorough investigation has been made or is being carried out in search of his or her identity. It's a crime. What happened to smear Flynn and the Trump campaign involved crimes by senior DOJ officials. Perhaps it was Sally Yates that committed the crime, perhaps others, but it needs to be investigated, and there was no way in this world that Robert Mueller was going to investigate anything to do with corruption in the Obama administration. There it was, all these leaks that were clear, most each of them would have been a crime, plenty of evidence there to support. But instead, Special Counsel Robert Mueller pursued things and got indictment for things that made clear we didn't need a special counsel to do what Bob Mueller was doing. You look back, there's nothing he did, nothing he produced that could not have been done without a special counsel's office. In fact, he ended up having to pass some stuff off to the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. Even as badly compromised as Bob Mueller was from even being special counsel, he recognized he had gone beyond his limits, as broad as they were, and needed to pass some of those things off. Another article here from Brooke Sigmund, DOJ watchdog reportedly scrutinizing role of FBI informant in the Russia probe. Talks about Inspector General Michael Horowitz looking into Stephen Halper's work during the Russia probe, as well as his work with the FBI prior to the start of that probe. And article goes on to talk about Halper. I mean, he was used to try to set up Michael Flynn. He was used to try to set up Papadopoulos, used to try to set up Sam Clovis. That was the insurance policy that Peter Strzok, Lisa Page texted lovingly back and forth about, although to the ignorance of Peter Strzok's wife. Some people think when I asked Peter Strzok in our judiciary hearing about him having that same smirk the hundreds of times he lied to his wife. That was inappropriate, violated the rules. Well, the rules in our committees are extremely relaxed compared to rules in a jury trial, of which I've had many as a litigant and as a judge. I know the rules. And I heard him in his deposition talk about how he never lies, he just always tells the truth. And I knew he was lying when he said basically he remembered Frank Rucker, the investigator for the Intelligence Inspector General, coming over and advising. He remembers Frank Rucker coming over and advised about something, but he didn't remember what it was about. And I guarantee you he was lying when he said that, because when Frank Rucker went over, and it's now public, I knew at the time, but it's now been made public, it was China, and the Intelligence Inspector General knew China was getting every email going in and out of Hillary Clinton's private server. And since Strzok and others apparently had protected information about what happened with her server, here comes the Intelligence Inspector General's investigator that discovered the fact that her private server had been compromised. And he rushes over with Jeanette Mitchell from the intelligence community. She was her attorney. They briefed Dean Chappelle, that was the FBI liaison with Intel, and the FBI's head of counterintelligence, Peter Strzok. And he tells him, look, we now have proof positive. Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked. We found this anomaly in there. And as I dug in to figure out what is this thing, it was an embedded placement in the server that directed every email coming in and every email going out of Hillary Clinton's private server that we also know contained classified information, directed it to go to a known front organization for the Chinese government. And Peter Strzok, after all the protection he tried to afford Hillary Clinton, he's going to sit there and lie and say, well, I remember Frank Rucker coming over and telling something, but I don't really remember what it was. He remembered very well what Frank Rucker said. That was a lie. And since he had said previously he told the truth, then any time he had ever told a lie, it would have been admissible in front of a jury, even with the more restricted rules of evidence. You could have asked about every time he ever lied. I just chose to make one blanket question about the hundreds of times he lied to his wife. He does not always tell the truth. He's a liar, and he lied there under oath. And that wasn't the only thing. Yep, as David Ignatius, that participated as a recipient of a crime, really, sending him leaked information from either the Justice Department, FBI, NSA, any one of them that submitted information to him, committed a crime. We need to know who it was. We need to know how deep and how far these crimes committed by our people who are supposed to be investigating crimes, not committing them, how far this goes. And now that Mueller will be out of the picture, I think we've got a chance to get those things determined. As long as he was there, then really these folks were protected. But now that he is finished wasting America's money and time, now we can start getting down to investigating the real crimes that occurred. I want to finish as I came across, got a copy of a wonderful book, really interesting, called Dark Agenda by David Horowitz. was in his presence once, and I introduced him as he was a former socialist. And David Horowitz, turning 80 this year, said, "No, I was a communist. I was a complete communist. I was one of those rebelling in the 60s. I was part of the riots and all those things." But he came to understand that communism doesn't work, never has. Socialism doesn't work. And Margaret Thatcher says the reason it doesn't work is because eventually you run out of other people's money. But I would submit that the answer I got at a Ukrainian collective forum back in the 70s, I said, "Why aren't you out working in the field mid-morning?" Farmer says, "I make the same number of rubles if I'm out there in the sun as I do in the shade, so I stay in the shade." Those that are crazy enough to work while others are getting paid the same as them eventually quit working and the whole system falls. It always does. It sounds wonderful, share and share alike. Oh, isn't that socialism or communism? Isn't that just wonderful, share and share alike? A Christian ought to be in favor of that, except it requires in this world a totalitarian government strong enough, powerful enough to take from those who earn and give to those who don't, and strong enough to suppress anybody that objects. And eventually it falls. It can't work. It never will work, never has worked. But David Horowitz deals with another subject here in Dark Agenda, and I think it's worth hearing his words himself. The first chapter is named "Religion Must Die." He starts on Sunday morning, November 5th, 2017. A gunman walked into First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. He wore tactical gear and a black face mask marked with a white skull. He carried a semi-automatic rifle. He shot and killed 2 people outside the church, then went inside, walking up and down the aisle, cursing and shooting people in the pews. He reloaded again and again, emptying 15 magazines of ammunition. When the gunman emerged from the church, he found an armed citizen facing him from across the street, a former NRA firearms instructor named Stephen Williford. The 2 men exchanged fire. Williford hit the gunman in the leg and upper body. The wounded shooter limped to his car and sped away. He was later found at the wheel of his crashed car, killed by a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. The attack killed 26 people, ages 5 to 72, and wounded 20. The killer had been court-martialed in the Air Force for domestic violence. He had beaten his wife, cracked the skull of his infant stepson. The Air Force failed to report his conviction to the FBI's crime information database. So parenthetically, we didn't need new laws. We just needed people to obey the laws that we had. The FBI violated the law, and this guy got his gun as a result. Or the Air Force, rather, failed to obey the law and report this to the FBI's crime information database. He got a gun and did destruction. But Horowitz says the slaughter of unarmed Christians in a church sanctuary was a cowardly attack on one church. But what happened after the church shooting was part of a wider war by the political left against Christians and Christianity. As news of the shooting broke, prominent Christians took to Twitter and urged fellow believers to pray. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, a devout Roman Catholic, tweeted, quote, "Reports out of Texas are devastating. The people of Sutherland Springs need our prayers right now," unquote. From Hollywood to New York and Washington, the left responded with a chorus of jeers and insults. Former MSNBC political commentator Keith Olbermann suggested in a tweet that Speaker Ryan should proctologize himself with his prayers. Seattle Democrat Representative Pramila Jayapal tweeted, quote, they were praying when it happened. They don't need our prayers. They need us to address gun violence, unquote. Comedian Paula Poundstone sneered, quote, if prayers were the answer to mass shootings, wouldn't people at a church service be safe, unquote. Actor Will Wheaton tweeted, quote, the murdered victims were in a church. If prayers did anything, they'd still be alive, you worthless sack of ... unquote. These and other comments from the secular left displayed not only a smug disdain for Christians, but an amazing ignorance of how religious Christians view prayer. And keep in mind, David Horowitz, he's been an atheist, he's Jewish, and he's writing this book. Amazing. Christians don't need prayer as a magic incantation to make themselves bulletproof. Christians believe in the teachings of Christ, who warned them, quote, in the world ye shall have tribulation, unquote. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ prayed to be delivered from the agony of the cross. But he ended his prayer, quote, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, unquote. The answer to Christ's prayer was silence. He was later crucified on a Roman cross. In her commentary on the church shooting, MSNBC host Joy-Ann Reid tweeted, quote, when Jesus of Nazareth came upon thousands of hungry people, he didn't pray, he fed the people. Horowitz says she's simply wrong. Matthew 14:19 records, before Jesus fed the people, he looked heavenward and he prayed. Jesus prayed and he acted. That's how his followers still view prayer. They pray and they act. And around the same time, Joy-Ann Reid was tweeting, the Billy Graham Rapid Response Team was already in action, rolling into Sutherland Springs with 16 chaplains to comfort grieving families and help meet their material needs. 2 days after the shooting, the Southern Baptist Convention announced it would pay all funeral expenses for the 26 slain churchgoers. Because this is a world made by flawed human beings, it will continue to be a world of tribulations. There will be more shootings, attacks, fires, floods, earthquakes, and other tragedies. Christians will call for prayer. Leftists will mock them for it, imagining there are solutions that can perfect this life and regarding Christians as the enemies of that perfection. Since its birth in the fires of the French Revolution, the political left has been at war with religion, and with the Christian religion in particular. Again, this is really interesting coming from an atheist Jewish individual. Horowitz says, in a symbolic revolutionary act, the Jacobin leaders of the French Revolution changed the name of the Cathedral of Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason. Then in the same reason, they proceeded to massacre the inhabitants of the Vendée region of west central France because its citizens were Catholics. This has been called the first modern genocide, but it was far from the last. Karl Marx famously described religion as, quote, the opium of the people, unquote, and, quote, the sigh of the oppressed, unquote. Inspired by his hatred ever since, revolutionaries have regarded religion as the enemy of progress and the mask of oppression. In Russia, Marx's disciples removed religious teachings from the schools, outlawed criticism of atheists and agnostics, and burned 100,000 churches. When priests demanded freedom of religion, they were sentenced to death. Between 1917 and 1935, 130,000 Russian Orthodox priests were arrested, 95,000 of which were executed by firing squad. Radicals in America today don't have the political power to execute religious people and destroy their houses of worship, yet they openly declare their desire to obliterate religion. In their own minds, their intentions are noble. They want to save the human race from the social injustice and oppression that religion allegedly inflicts on humanity. Quote, religion must die in order for mankind to live, unquote, proclaimed left-wing commentator and comedian Bill Maher in Religulous, the most watched documentary feature of 2008. Both title and script were transparent attempts to stigmatize religious people as the dangerous morons whose views could not be taken seriously. Throughout the film, Maher travels to Jerusalem, the Vatican, Salt Lake City, as well as other centers of religion, interviewing believers and making them appear foolish. How did he gain interviews with his victims? He lied to them, saying he was making a film called A Spiritual Journey. According to Maher, quote, "The irony of religion is that because of its power to divert man to destructive courses, the world could actually come to an end," unquote. He predicts the destruction of the human race as a result of religion-inspired nuclear terrorism. Hence the need for religion to die if mankind is to live. Maher's views accurately reflect the attitudes of a movement called the New Atheism, whose leaders are prominent scientists, best-selling authors, far superior in intellect to Maher, but equally contemptuous of religion and religious believers. Like Maher's film, the New Atheism movement seeks to discredit all religious belief by caricaturing its adherents as simpletons and worse. The stated goal of the New Atheism is to delegitimize and extinguish the religious point of view. Maher's suggestion that religion, and evidently religion alone, threatens the existence of the human race is simply malicious. Both he and the New Atheists are blind to all the positive influences religion has had on human behavior, and they ignore all the atheist-inspired genocides of the last 250 years. In the 20th century alone, communist atheists slaughtered more than 100 million people in Russia, China, and Indonesia. Not even the bloodthirsty jihadists of radical Islam have killed innocents on anything close to such a scale. It's striking that Maher and the New Atheists ignore the appalling body count of Marxism, an ideology that is explicitly atheistic, whose atrocities were committed in the name of social justice. According to Maher, it's religious people who are irrationalists and dangerous because they steer the ship of state not by a compass, but by the equivalent of reading the entrails of a chicken. Yet civilization was built and improved by such irrationalists. Believers like Locke, Newton, Washington, Wilberforce, Sojourner Truth, and Abraham Lincoln. For the 5 millennia of recorded history, with few exceptions, the most rational, compassionate, and successful decision makers, both military and civilian, have been people guided by belief in God, including some whose spiritual compass took the form of reading the entrails of a chicken. That's David Horowitz' sense of humor. But near the end of Maher's rant, he pauses to address any religionist who may have unwittingly strayed into the cinema where Religulous was playing. Look in the mirror and realize that the solace and comfort that religion brings you actually comes at a terrible price. If you belong to a political party or a social club that was tied to as much bigotry, misogyny, homophobia, violence, and sheer ignorance as religion is, you'd resign and protest. Horowitz says, how myopic, and the crimes and horrors committed by atheism, from the French Revolution to the Bolshevik, from the Vendée to Vietnam, the bigotries and atrocities committed by the forces of godlessness match and outweigh those committed by the forces of godliness. If a history of violence, persecution, and murder serves to discredit an ideology, why hasn't Maher resigned in protest from the party of atheism? I appreciate those brilliant, insightful observations by an atheist Jew who is a friend. Amazing, from a man who is an overt, unapologetic, rebellious communist to now having written a good account of the war to destroy Christian America. With that, I yield back.